December 7th, 1941. The waters of Pearl Harbor still boiled with fire and oil when the Pacific War began its spiral of brutality. In its wake came a conflict defined by merciless fighting, bitter hatred, and the crushing belief that surrender was equal to dishonor. For Japanese soldiers, capture was unthinkable. They had been told that Allied imprisonment meant humiliation, starvation, and torture. Yet, one quiet morning in 1945, somewhere on the shattered soil of the Philippines, a group of ragged, starving Japanese prisoners of war braced for what they thought would be their final torment. Their eyes narrowed, their fists clenched. They expected blows, humiliation, perhaps a slow, cruel death at the hands of vengeful enemies. Instead, the air filled with the smell of frying batter, the clatter of tin cups, and the warmth of steaming black coffee. The scene was almost surreal. The prisoners had been marched at dawn, guarded by American soldiers whose uniforms bore the dust of the tropics and whose rifles glinted under the weak sun. Every step the Japanese took was heavy with dread. The war had taught them to expect cruelty, to brace themselves for the lash of a bayonet or the jeer of a guard. But when the column reached the clearing, it was not the whip of brutality that awaited them. It was breakfast. Plates of pancakes stacked high, butter melting down their sides, sweet syrup glistening like amber in the morning light. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, their gaunt faces frozen between disbelief and suspicion. Some thought it was a cruel trick, a psychological weapon designed to break their spirit. Others dared not even breathe too deeply, afraid that the scent of food was nothing more than a phantom of hunger. This moment, simple and almost absurd in its contrast to the war raging around it, spoke volumes about the clash of cultures and expectations that defined the Pacific theater. For the Japanese, indoctrinated from birth to believe capture was a fate worse than death, this unexpected kindness was not only shocking, it was incomprehensible. They had been warned that Americans were demons, brutes who mocked the suffering of their enemies. Yet here, the supposed demons offered pancakes and coffee. Food was not just sustenance, it was an act of mercy, a bridge between enemies forged in the most unlikely of ways. The night before, the jungle had echoed with sporadic gunfire. A skirmish, brief and savage, had ended with scattered Japanese survivors surrendering, too wounded and exhausted to continue. In another context, their fate might have been sealed. Executions of prisoners were not unheard of on either side. The fury of war had stripped men of compassion, replacing it with cold vengeance. But on this morning, the American soldiers who stood watch over their captives made a decision that defied the brutal rhythm of the Pacific campaign. Rather than punishment, they chose civility. Rather than cruelty, they offered humanity. For the prisoners, it was a meal that shattered years of indoctrination. For the guards, it was an assertion of something deeper, that even in war one could hold to a moral code. The prisoners' hands trembled as the food was distributed. Some reached slowly, hesitantly, as if the pancakes might vanish the moment they touched them. A few refused at first, their pride refusing to accept what their bodies so desperately needed. Yet hunger is a relentless conqueror. Within moments, the sound of chewing and the quiet sipping of coffee filled the air. A silence hung over the group, broken only by the hiss of the griddle and the crackle of firewood. The Japanese prisoners, who had prepared their hearts for torture, instead found themselves caught in the strange, disarming normalcy of an American breakfast. But beneath the surface, tension lingered. The Americans knew that these were men who, hours earlier, might have fought to the death against them. They watched carefully, rifles slung but never far from reach. The prisoners, meanwhile, swallowed each bite with conflicted emotions. To accept this food was to accept defeat. To drink this coffee was to acknowledge dependence on the very enemy they had been taught to despise. For many, the humiliation was profound, yet with every sip of hot coffee, with every mouthful of pancakes, survival outweighed shame. The sun climbed higher, washing the clearing in golden light. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as if even nature was stunned by the spectacle. No shots were fired, no blows were struck. Instead, men from two nations locked in total war shared a breakfast that belonged more to a farmhouse in Kansas than to a battlefield in the Pacific. And it was precisely this dissonance that gave the moment its power. For both the captors and the captured, it was a reminder, brief, fragile, but undeniable, that humanity could still flicker through the smoke of war. Whispers spread among the prisoners. Some wondered aloud if this was merely a prelude to interrogation, a tactic to lower their guard. Others began to question the propaganda they had been fed for years. Could it be that the Americans were not the monsters they had been told? Could mercy exist in the midst of such a merciless conflict? For the guards, too, the moment carried weight. They knew this war demanded ruthlessness, yet here they were, ladling syrup onto the plates of their enemies. The act was not weakness, it was strength. It was the ability to hold onto one's humanity while surrounded by inhumanity. The smell of coffee drifted into the trees, carried on the breeze, as if to mock the cruelty that so often defined the Pacific front. In that clearing, the war paused, not in treaties or speeches, but in silence, chewing, and the clink of tin cups. Men who would never have met in peace sat together, bound by hunger, bewilderment, and the fragile threads of compassion. It was not a grand battle. It was not a turning point in strategy. Yet, for those who lived it, it was unforgettable. As the plates emptied and the last of the coffee was drained, the reality of war crept back in. The prisoners were marched again, their heads bowed, their futures uncertain, but something had changed. They had been given a glimpse of a truth their leaders had hidden from them. The enemy could be merciful. The enemy could be human. And perhaps, in some unspoken way, that truth cut deeper than any bullet or blade. One meal, pancakes and coffee. Against the vast backdrop of a world at war, it was nothing. But for the men who lived that morning, it was everything. A reminder that, even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity has a way of breaking through. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a crucible of exhaustion, brutality, and desperation. The empire that had once surged across Asia with unstoppable ferocity now found itself cornered, its armies battered, its fleets scattered, its skies dominated by American bombers. From the steaming jungles of Burma to the volcanic islands of the Marianas, the Japanese fought on, but the tide had long since turned. The Allies had learned how to fight in this theater, adapting to the heat, the terrain, and the ferocity of an enemy that refused to yield. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It had become a battlefield of attrition, where every palm tree, every ridge, and every reef was soaked in blood. To understand the shocking moment when prisoners received pancakes and coffee, one must first understand the mindset of the men who expected instead to be beaten or executed. For Japanese soldiers, capture was not simply defeat. It was a betrayal of everything they had been taught since childhood. The Bushido-inspired code drilled into them held that surrender was dishonor, worse even than death. Propaganda leaflets and training manuals described Allied troops as sadistic, barbaric, and merciless. They were told that to fall into enemy hands was to invite torture, mutilation, and slow death. Better, they believed, to fight to the last cartridge or to end one's life with a grenade clasped to the chest than to endure the shame of captivity. The war itself reinforced those fears. From Guadalcanal to Saipan, stories circulated among Japanese ranks of captured soldiers never returning, their fates whispered with dread. On the other side, Allied soldiers, hardened by ambushes and night assaults, often viewed surrendering Japanese with suspicion, sometimes treating them as dangerous even after they laid down their arms. Incidents of prisoners being executed out of frustration or revenge were not uncommon. In this climate of hatred and mistrust, the act of offering a meal instead of a blow was not just unusual, it was radical. The Philippines had become one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the war. In 1942, American and Filipino forces had been forced into the infamous Bataan Death March, where tens of thousands suffered under the merciless bayonets of Japanese guards. For 3 years, memories of that cruelty burned in the minds of American troops. By the time General Douglas MacArthur returned in 1944, the campaign to liberate the islands was not just a military mission, it was personal. Battles at Leyte and Luzon shredded Japanese formations, leaving scattered remnants to fight on in isolated pockets. Hunger gnawed at these survivors, their uniforms tattered, their rifles often without ammunition. Some melted into the jungle, clinging to an impossible hope of reinforcements. Others, too broken to fight, stumbled into Allied hands. It was in this theater of bitterness that the scene unfolded. The captured men expecting vengeance, the Americans confronting enemies who only years earlier had inflicted atrocities on their comrades. The clash of expectations was profound. The Japanese braced for cruelty because cruelty was what they had been taught to expect. The Americans, though scarred by their own losses, chose instead to uphold a different standard. They had food, resources, and discipline. They had the ability to show that their strength was not only in rifles and tanks, but in the moral conviction that separated them from the savagery they despised. The prisoners who experienced that breakfast were part of a collapsing army, one that had been promised glory and honor but had found only hunger and despair. Their officers, often bound by the code of no surrender, abandoned them to their fate. In such an environment, the kindness of an enemy meal did more than fill a stomach. It shattered illusions. It forced men who had believed Americans to be devils to confront the possibility that they were men, flawed, human, but capable of mercy. The shock of the moment can only be fully appreciated against the dark canvas of the Pacific War's cruelty. Beheadings, starvation, torture, and massacre were etched into the memories of both sides. That is why the pancakes mattered. That is why the coffee mattered. It was not just breakfast. It was defiance. Defiance of the hatred that defined the war. Defiance of the narratives spun by governments to turn men into monsters. It was a reminder that even in the most savage theaters of conflict, humanity could still make itself heard. As the war neared its end, moments like these foreshadowed the complexities of the post-war world. Soon, Japan would surrender, its people confronted with the reality of defeat and occupation. American soldiers would find themselves not only as conquerors, but as administrators, rebuilding the very nation they had fought to destroy. The seeds of that transformation lay in small gestures as much as in grand strategies. Pancakes and coffee, symbols of normal life in America, became tools of disarmament more powerful than bullets. And so, the stage was set. A war of annihilation gave way to glimpses of reconciliation. On that morning, With the jungle quiet and the fire crackling under the griddle, two enemies met not as beasts, but as men. It was not peace, it was not forgiveness, but it was the first crack in a wall of hatred built over years of war. The secret advantage was not forged in silence, nor hidden in the barrels of cannons or the armor of tanks. It was something far more subtle, yet just as decisive. It was the ability of the Americans to surprise the Japanese, not only with their overwhelming firepower, but with their humanity. For men who had been trained to believe capture was a fate worse than death, the simple act of being fed instead of flogged was a revelation. And it was this contrast, the expected cruelty replaced with mercy, that became a hidden weapon in itself, undermining Japanese resolve and reshaping their understanding of the enemy. From the earliest days of the Pacific War, Japanese indoctrination had painted a picture of Americans as monsters. Soldiers were told their captors would carve them apart, humiliate them, or leave them to rot in cages. It was a picture so vivid, so terrifying, that entire units chose death over surrender. On Saipan, thousands hurled themselves from cliffs rather than be captured. On Peleliu and Iwo Jima, men fought to the last bullet, the last bayonet thrust, the last desperate charge. In this context, surrendering meant entering the abyss. And so, when prisoners finally fell into American hands, they braced for agony. That fear itself was a weapon, a barrier that kept Japanese soldiers fighting long past the point of reason. But then came the unexpected. Instead of blows, there was food. Instead of mockery, there was civility. Pancakes and coffee, symbols of an ordinary American breakfast, became instruments of psychological warfare. To a starving soldier, their warmth and sweetness carried a message more powerful than 1,000 leaflets dropped from the sky. The Americans were not demons. They were human. And more dangerously still, they could show kindness. It was not the first time food had been wielded as a weapon. Across history, armies have used bread, rice, or even salt as tools to win submission. But in the Pacific, where cruelty was expected, mercy became the deadliest weapon of all. A Japanese soldier, convinced he would be tortured, suddenly found himself disarmed by the smell of syrup. His mental fortress cracked, and with it cracked the foundations of the Bushido Code. If surrender could bring pancakes instead of pain, why cling to suicide? If the enemy could show compassion, perhaps surrender was not dishonor but survival. American commanders understood this effect, even if they did not always articulate it. The Geneva Conventions demanded humane treatment of prisoners. But in practice, the act of serving a proper meal to captured enemies was more than legal compliance. It was psychological strategy. Reports filtered through prisoner interrogations revealed the shock of such gestures. Prisoners returned to their camps whispering that the Americans were not what they had been told. The myths collapsed under the weight of a steaming plate of food. The Germans, too, had once believed their enemies were barbarians, but the Japanese belief in American cruelty was far deeper, rooted in culture and pride. Their government had filled their heads with visions of horror. The Americans, whether consciously or instinctively, countered that propaganda not with leaflets or speeches, but with lived experience. It was not enough to tell prisoners that they would be treated well. They had to taste it. They had to smell it. They had to hold it in their hands. In that clearing in the Philippines, the prisoners faced a dilemma that cut deeper than hunger. To accept food from the enemy was to accept that the enemy was capable of decency. To drink American coffee was to admit that perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. For some, this realization was unbearable, striking at the core of their identity as warriors. For others, it was a crack of light breaking through years of darkness. Either way, the advantage was clear. The Americans had found a way to turn kindness into a weapon that fractured the enemy's spirit. The shock reverberated beyond the individual. In time, word spread to other units. Whispers traveled through the jungle. Surrender might not mean death. The Americans fed their prisoners. They gave them medical care. They treated them as men, not animals. Each whisper eroded the power of Japanese propaganda, weakening the bonds of fear that held soldiers in fanatical resistance. Pancakes became more than breakfast. They became a signal, a beacon of psychological pressure that worked silently behind the roar of artillery. This hidden advantage extended to morale on the American side as well. Soldiers who served those breakfasts, who upheld the code of humane treatment, were reminded that they were fighting not merely to destroy an enemy, but to defend a way of life. The act of feeding a prisoner reaffirmed the idea that their cause was righteous, that they fought not with savagery but with civilization. For men hardened by years of jungle war, this reminder of humanity mattered. It kept their sense of purpose alive amid the blood and mud. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a bitter contradiction. On the battlefield, they were told that Americans were beasts, incapable of honor. In captivity, they found pancakes and coffee. Some prisoners struggled with this paradox, torn between indoctrination and reality. Others embraced it, finding in their captors' kindness a path to survival. The contradiction itself was corrosive. It sowed doubt where once there had been certainty, and in war, doubt can be as deadly as bullets.
The fourth one is making sounds, whining, barking, or howling. Have you ever shut the door and heard your dog cry on the other side? That sound can break your heart. For them, it's panic mixed with sadness. Some dogs calm down after a while, others keep making sounds until they're distracted.
The technical backbone of this abundance was the American logistics machine. At its heart lay the Liberty ship, a vessel of steel built not for beauty, but for speed of production. Each Liberty ship, 441 feet long and powered by triple expansion steam engines, could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo. Factories across the United States produced them in staggering numbers. 2,110 in total, launched faster than Japan could sink them. These ships carried everything from ammunition to medical supplies, from tanks to sacks of flour. They carried the batter that would become pancakes in a jungle clearing. They carried the roasted beans that would be brewed into black coffee. Supporting this lifeline were the sea rations, the standardized field meals of the American soldier. Designed in laboratories and tested in training grounds, each sea ration tin carried the essence of American industry into the field. Powdered eggs, flour mixes, and instant coffee crystals became staples of the GI diet. By 1945, production lines churned out millions of such rations, ensuring that even in the remote corners of Luzon or Leyte, soldiers could cook a breakfast that carried the taste of home. The SCR 625 field stove, fueled by gasoline, allowed men to heat water, fry batter, and brew coffee even under the canopy of jungle. To the Japanese prisoners, who had not seen a warm, prepared meal in months, these simple devices might as well have been sorcery. Japanese equipment told a different story. Their supply lines had been severed by relentless submarine campaigns. The once proud convoys of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been whittled down to rusting hulks on the ocean floor. Where the Americans could pour flour from sacks stamped with factory seals, the Japanese boiled tree bark. Where the Americans brewed coffee in metal pots, the Japanese gnawed raw roots to keep hunger at bay. This was not simply a difference of taste. It was the manifestation of a global war economy. The United States, with its factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, could supply pancakes to the battlefield. Japan, blockaded and starving, could not even supply rice to its soldiers. Every bite of pancake was, therefore, a technical demonstration. The wheat had been harvested in Kansas, milled in Midwestern factories, shipped by rail to coastal ports, loaded onto Liberty ships, carried across the Pacific, unloaded at Leyte or Manila, stored in depots, driven by truck into the jungle, and finally fried on a field stove in the Philippines. The coffee beans had been grown in Latin America, roasted in American plants, sealed in tins, and carried along the same path. To a prisoner, this chain of supply was invisible, but its reality was undeniable. It was proof that American power was not only measured in bombers and tanks, but in the ability to bring comfort to the battlefield. The contrast extended even into the tools of cooking. American GIs relied on standardized mess kits, aluminum trays stamped with compartments, utensils forged in factories by the millions. Japanese soldiers carried canteens and mess tins often fashioned from inferior materials as the war dragged on. By 1945, many had none at all, forced to scavenge or eat from makeshift containers. In that clearing, as Americans ladled syrup from metal tins onto stacks of golden pancakes, the technological gulf became a visible chasm. The syrup itself, thick and sweet, was a marvel of preservation technology, made possible by tin can sealing processes perfected in American industry. For engineers and inventors back home, this was victory. The men of the War Production Board, the factory workers who labored on assembly lines, the chemists who devised instant coffee, all had unknowingly contributed to a psychological weapon. Their work ensured that when the Japanese prisoners sat down expecting pain, they instead received the smell of frying batter. The industrial effort that built aircraft carriers and bombers also built pancakes, and in that moment, it was the pancakes that cut deeper. But technology was not merely about production, it was about communication. Radios crackled with orders that directed convoys across oceans. Telegraph lines connected depots to command centers. A single message could redirect a ship carrying food to starving troops, ensuring that abundance reached even the outer edges of battle. For the Japanese, communication lines had long since gone silent. Their radios sputtered with static. Their supply depots lay in ruins, bombed from the air. Their soldiers, isolated and starving, fought on with no hope of resupply. To them, the sight of pancakes was not only a meal, it was a reminder of their isolation, a cruel revelation of the empire's collapse. It is easy to underestimate the power of such details. One might ask, what difference could pancakes make in a war defined by carriers and atom bombs? But the answer lies in the human heart. To fight on an empty stomach is to fight against despair. To eat well is to fight with hope. For the Japanese prisoners, the taste of American food was not just nourishment, it was humiliation, awe, and bewilderment all at once. It reminded them of the enemy's strength, of the futility of resistance, and of the strange mercy of being allowed to taste sweetness in a world gone bitter. And so, the technical marvels of American industry found their way into the war's smallest moments. The roar of B-29s over Tokyo, the thud of Sherman tanks rolling through Luzon, and the hiss of a field stove frying batter in the jungle, all were connected by the same supply machine. To the historian's eye, the pancakes and coffee were not accidental. They were the product of a system that could carry comfort into chaos. They were a demonstration that war, as much as it is fought with steel, is also fought with bread. For the prisoners, it was bewildering. For the Americans, it was routine. But in that gap lay the truth of the Pacific War. One side starved on the edges of empire. The other fed even its prisoners with the bounty of an industrial giant. At dawn on March 10th, 1945, the jungles of Luzon trembled with the thunder of artillery. American guns boomed across ridges as infantry advanced into the tangled green, determined to root out the remnants of the once mighty Japanese 14th Area Army. What had begun as a proud fighting force of hundreds of thousands was now a scattered, starving remnant, clinging desperately to ravines and caves. Their uniforms were in tatters, their faces gaunt, their weapons often rusted or empty of ammunition. Yet their spirit, fueled by indoctrination and fear of capture, still urged them to fight to the last breath. On this morning, however, something extraordinary happened. A Japanese outpost, cut off from supply lines and battered by weeks of bombardment, finally laid down its arms. The survivors emerged from the jungle like ghosts, skeletal, hollow-eyed, their bodies broken by disease and hunger. They had expected bullets. They had expected bayonets. Instead, they found themselves marched under guard toward a small American field camp, where smoke rose not from shell fire, but from a cooking fire. The prisoners braced for cruelty, every step heavy with dread. The propaganda they had absorbed since childhood insisted that surrender to Americans was a path to humiliation, mutilation, and death. They shuffled forward in silence, waiting for the inevitable. Instead, when they reached the clearing, they froze in disbelief. On a battered metal griddle, GIs were flipping pancakes. The air was thick with the smell of frying batter, mingled with the rich aroma of coffee brewing in steel pots. For a moment, the scene seemed unreal, as if conjured from some memory of peace before the war had consumed their world. The guards ordered the men to sit. Rifles remained slung but ready, the balance between mercy and caution never forgotten. Slowly, cautiously, tin plates were filled and passed into the hands of the prisoners. Pancakes, golden and steaming. Syrup, thick and sweet. Coffee, black and scalding hot. At first, the Japanese hesitated. They stared at the food, suspicious that it might be a cruel trick. Some clutched their plates without eating, their eyes darting between their captors. But hunger is a merciless persuader. Within moments, hands trembled, lips moved, and the sound of chewing replaced the silence. One prisoner, too weak to lift the cup, was helped by an American guard who tipped the tin gently to his lips. Another, still clutching his officer's insignia, ate with tears streaming down his cheeks. The taste of sweetness, long forgotten, overwhelmed them. It was a simple meal, yet in that moment it became an act of mercy that cut deeper than any weapon. The Americans watched quietly, their faces unreadable, but inside, many felt the weight of what they were doing. They were feeding the same enemy who had once driven their comrades into the Bataan Death March, the same enemy who had ambushed them in jungles and caves. To show compassion now was no small choice. The after-action reports from that day record the incident in sparse military language. Prisoners received rations. But for those present, it was unforgettable. One GI wrote later in his diary, "They expected we would beat them. Instead, we gave them flapjacks. Their faces. I'll never forget." Another described how one prisoner broke down completely, sobbing as he ate, whispering in Japanese words the Americans could not understand. It was the collapse of a lifetime of lies, undone by a plate of food. The Japanese command had long feared this moment. Reports from earlier in the campaign already suggested that American treatment of prisoners was undermining morale. Interrogations revealed that soldiers who surrendered were stunned by fair treatment, spreading stories back through the ranks whenever escapees carried tales home. For the high command, this was poison. The entire war effort depended on fanatical resistance. If soldiers began to believe that surrender could mean life, not death, the foundation of Bushido would crumble. That morning in Luzon was one of countless small cracks that widened into a collapse. The numbers were stark. In the Philippines, American forces captured tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers during the final campaigns. While many still fought to the death, increasing numbers surrendered when cut off and starving. At least 10,000 were processed into camps by mid-1945, their stories of survival spreading like whispered fire through the wreckage of the Imperial Army. Each story was a weapon, not forged in steel, but in kindness. The Pancakes of Luzon became as much a part of the war as the shells that thundered through its jungles. German reports from Europe echoed a similar disbelief. Captured Japanese officers, interrogated after the war, admitted their astonishment at American rations. They could not understand how a nation at war could feed its prisoners better than Japan fed its own troops. For them, the pancakes were not merely food, but a demonstration of overwhelming power. The United States could afford to show mercy because its resources were limitless. That fact, more than bullets, convinced many that the war was truly lost. Yet, for the prisoners themselves, the moment carried more than political weight. It carried emotional power. Men who had resigned themselves to a violent end suddenly found life instead. It did not erase their guilt, their shame, or their indoctrination. but it gave them a chance to survive, to return home after the war. Some would later tell their families of the day the enemy gave them breakfast instead of death. Some would never speak of it, ashamed that mercy had come from those they had been told were monsters. But all of them remembered. The pancakes and coffee became a battlefield in their own right. They fought not with fire but with sweetness, not with steel but with warmth. They undermined decades of propaganda in a single bite. They revealed to the prisoners that America's true strength was not only in its tanks and bombers, but in its ability to remain human in a war that had stripped so many of their humanity. And as the war dragged on, those breakfasts, small unrecorded acts of mercy scattered across the Pacific, added up. Each one chipped away at the will to resist, convincing more soldiers to lay down their arms. Each one reinforced the conviction among Americans that they fought not to become monsters, but to defeat them. It was not always consistent, not always universal. War is too cruel for that. But where it happened, it mattered. That morning on Luzon was one such moment. The jungle still echoed with gunfire in the distance, the war still raged, and death still lurked in every shadow. But in that clearing, for a few fragile hours, pancakes and coffee became weapons more powerful than rifles. They broke the enemy's spirit, and in doing so, they revealed a truth too often forgotten, that mercy, even in war, can change the course of battle. The shock of pancakes and coffee rippled far beyond a single morning in the Philippines. What seemed at first like a small act of civility became, in truth, a weapon of profound psychological force. Wars are not only fought with bullets and bombs, they are fought with fear, belief, and perception. In this war, where Japanese indoctrination had drilled into soldiers that surrender meant torture and death, the act of receiving kindness struck deeper than any rifle shot. It reshaped the battlefield not through destruction, but through dissonance. For the Japanese prisoners, the impact was immediate and personal. Many had been prepared to meet their end with stoic defiance, whispering farewells in their minds as they braced for brutality. Instead, they found themselves chewing pancakes, sipping coffee, and being treated with a measure of dignity. The experience created a fracture in their worldview. To accept the food was to admit that everything they had been told about the enemy was false. For some, this realization came with relief. For others, it came with shame so deep it felt unbearable. But in both cases, the damage to morale was irreversible. The effect spread outward like ripples in water. Prisoners who survived captivity became living proof that the Americans did not torture. Their stories, whispered between men in the barracks, scribbled in letters that somehow made it past censors, began to undermine the fear that held so many Japanese troops in suicidal resistance. If surrender meant life and life meant food, perhaps survival was not dishonor after all. Pancakes and coffee became a weapon against fanaticism. American commanders recognized this impact. Psychological warfare was not a new concept, but here it took an unexpected form. Instead of leaflets promising humane treatment, instead of loudspeakers urging surrender, it was breakfast that carried the message. A Japanese soldier who had tasted kindness was a better messenger than any propaganda pamphlet. He was living proof that surrender was possible. This, in turn, saved American lives. Every Japanese unit that surrendered rather than fought to the death meant fewer ambushes, fewer banzai charges, fewer names carved onto American graves. The Germans, on the far side of the world, often noted the same effect. Wehrmacht officers who analyzed the Pacific theater after the war marveled at how American logistics and discipline allowed them to maintain humane treatment even against a hated enemy. One German general remarked in frustration, "They feed their prisoners better than we feed our troops." To the Japanese, this was not just humiliating, it was devastating. It meant that the empire for which they fought, the empire that demanded they die with honor, had left them to starve, while their enemy fed them pancakes. On the American side, the impact was no less significant. Soldiers who participated in such acts felt a reaffirmation of their cause. They had witnessed barbarity firsthand: the Bataan Death March, mutilations of captured comrades, ambushes staged under flags of surrender. Many harbored rage so deep it could have justified cruelty. Yet when they chose to offer food instead of punishment, they preserved something vital, their own humanity. In feeding their enemies, they reminded themselves that they were not fighting to become monsters, but to stop them. Still, the tension was palpable. Mercy in war is never simple. Some Americans seethed as they watched their rations handed to men who had once fought savagely against them. Some felt betrayal at the idea of giving pancakes to the same enemy who had starved American prisoners in 1942. For others, it was a point of pride, proof that they, unlike their foe, could uphold the ideals of decency even in the face of hatred. This duality, this struggle between vengeance and mercy, was the psychological battlefield within the American heart. For the Japanese prisoners, the psychological toll was even sharper. To eat from the enemy's hand was to acknowledge defeat, and for many, it was unbearable. Diaries recovered after the war revealed the inner torment of men who survived captivity. "I ate their food," one wrote, "and in that moment I ceased to be a soldier of the emperor." Yet beneath the shame lay something else. Gratitude, unspoken but deeply felt. A gratitude that kept men alive, that sent them home to families who otherwise would have mourned. Strategically, these acts had ripple effects. On islands across the Pacific, surrender rates, while still low compared to Europe, began to rise as the war dragged into its final year. Starvation drove many, but stories of American treatment pushed them across the line. The psychological advantage of kindness saved lives on both sides. Each surrendered prisoner was one less fanatic charging into machine gun fire. Each breakfast shared in captivity was one more seed planted against the poisonous propaganda of Tokyo. The cultural shock cannot be overstated. In Japanese society, food carried deep symbolic weight. Rice was sacred, a gift of the gods. To receive pancakes, a foreign food, strange in taste and texture, was to experience both alienation and revelation. It was foreign, yes, but it was also warm, nourishing, and real. The coffee, bitter and black, carried the taste of survival. It became a reminder that life could continue, even if honor had been broken. In this way, American food became a psychological bridge, forcing captives to reconsider their enemy, not as faceless demons, but as men. The psychological toll reached upward as well. Japanese officers, interrogated after the war, admitted that one of their greatest fears was the erosion of morale caused by American treatment of POWs. They had worked tirelessly to instill terror of capture, but reality had betrayed them. The pancakes and coffee of Luzon, Okinawa, and dozens of other small camps were not isolated gestures. They were part of a pattern that dissolved the empire's ideological armor. And so, in the grand sweep of strategy, pancakes and coffee carried as much weight as bullets. They broke the will of soldiers to fight to the death. They softened the hatred that might have consumed Americans in revenge. They shaped a battlefield of perception, morale, and psychology that was as decisive as any clash of armies. In war, victory is not only about killing the enemy. It is about convincing him that further resistance is futile. It is about breaking his will without necessarily breaking his body. On that morning in the Philippines, the Americans achieved just that, not with fire and steel, but with warmth and sweetness. The war continued, the killing did not stop, but a seed had been planted. Mercy had been shown, and, in the long war of psychology, that seed was a weapon the Japanese had never prepared for. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world awoke to the smoking ruins of an empire and the dawning shadow of the atomic age. Japan lay shattered, its cities burned, its armies broken, its people starving. Yet among the ashes remained the memories of countless moments, small and strange, that revealed the deeper truths of the war. For those Japanese soldiers who had once braced themselves for torture but found pancakes and coffee instead, the lesson lingered long after the flags of surrender were raised. The war had been defined by cruelty, but it was not cruelty that endured in their minds. It was mercy. The simple act of being fed, of being treated as human in the very moment they expected to be stripped of humanity, became a memory that outlasted the rage of battle. For many, it became the story they told to their children and grandchildren, not of tanks or bombers, but of breakfast with the enemy. And in those stories lay a seed of reconciliation, a reminder that even in the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, compassion had survived. In strategic terms, this advantage was not forgotten. American commanders came to understand that the war had not only been won with Sherman tanks, Essex-class carriers, and B-29 bombers, it had also been won with logistics, with abundance, and with the ability to wield mercy as a weapon. Feeding prisoners well was not just about the Geneva Conventions. It was about psychological warfare, about breaking the enemy's indoctrination, about planting doubt where once there had been fanatical resistance. That lesson carried forward into the Cold War, in Korea, in Vietnam, and even into the deserts of the Gulf War. The United States would again face enemies who believed American cruelty was inevitable. And time and again, the treatment of prisoners became a tool of persuasion. The principle was the same. By showing mercy, one could erode resistance. By demonstrating abundance, one could shatter the enemy's confidence. In modern military doctrine, this evolved into what strategists call network-centric warfare, the idea that information, perception, and morale are as decisive as guns. Pancakes and coffee had been an early, almost accidental glimpse into that future. For veterans, the memory of those breakfasts carried another weight. To the American soldiers who handed over their rations, the act was not just about psychology. It was about conscience. They had looked into the eyes of men they had been taught to hate and had chosen mercy. In doing so, they held on to something fragile but essential, their own humanity. In later years, as they spoke in veterans' halls or wrote in memoirs, some recalled the satisfaction of knowing that even in war, they had not surrendered to barbarism. Others remembered the shock on the faces of their prisoners and how it reminded them that the enemy was flesh and blood, not a demon conjured by propaganda. For the Japanese survivors, the legacy was complicated. Some carried shame, believing that to accept food from the enemy was to accept defeat twice over. Others carried gratitude, acknowledging quietly that pancakes and coffee had saved their lives. Still others buried the memory, unwilling to confront the dissonance between what they had believed and what they had experienced. Yet in the quiet corners of their families, the story surfaced. When I was captured, one man would tell his grandson decades later, I thought they would kill me. Instead, they gave me pancakes. The grandson would blink in disbelief, as if war could ever contain such a contradiction. The historians who study this era recognize that such small gestures cannot erase the vast cruelty of the Pacific War. The Bataan Death March, the massacres of civilians, the starvation of Allied POWs, all remain indelible scars. But the pancakes and coffee matter precisely because they stand against that darkness. They remind us that war is not monolithic. Within the inferno, there were sparks of light. Within the cruelty, there were moments of mercy. And those moments shaped the post-war world as surely as treaties and tribunals. In the grand arc of history, it is tempting to measure wars only by the steel of weapons or the sweep of armies. But sometimes, the true legacy lies in the smallest details. The warmth of a cup of coffee, the sweetness of syrup on a pancake. These details remind us that war is fought not only in the clash of machines, but in the choices of men. Choices to kill, yes, but also choices to show mercy. And it is those choices that echo longest in the memory of nations. When Japan rebuilt under American occupation, when former enemies became allies in the Cold War, the seeds of trust were not planted solely in conferences or political agreements. They were also planted in acts of unexpected humanity. Every soldier who survived because an enemy fed him carried into peace a story that contradicted the hate that had driven the war. In those stories, the groundwork of reconciliation was laid. As we look back today, with the distance of decades, the lesson is clear. Firepower can break an army, but mercy can break a myth. Pancakes and coffee became a weapon against lies, against indoctrination, against the belief that the enemy was inhuman. And in breaking that myth, they did what bullets could not. They built the possibility of peace. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs who prepared for torture but found pancakes and coffee instead is not just a curiosity of history. It is a parable, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion can be as powerful as cruelty. That mercy, unexpected and undeserved, can shake an enemy to his core. And that sometimes the future of nations is shaped not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet clink of tin cups at dawn. For the men who lived it, it was unforgettable. For us, it remains a lesson. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and mercy defeats fear. Pancakes and coffee, humble and ordinary, became symbols of an extraordinary truth, that even in total war, humanity can survive.